A key day in the preparation of the coup was the 6th of November. Sieyes and Napoleon finally composed their severe differences and agreed that after the coup a commission would draw up a new constitution. There would be a parliamentary strike against the Directory backed by a show of force. Meanwhile, Joseph, Talleyrand and Fouch spent the 6th vainly trying to win over Barras. That evening a disappointing day ended in virtual farce with the subscription dinner held at the Temple of Victory. Napoleon and Moreau were the guests of honor, but Bonaparte attended with great reluctance and brought his own food, some bread, a pear and a bottle of wine. Making it clear he trusted nobody, the Jacobin generals, Bernadotte, Jourdan and Augereau completed the farce by refusing to attend. The coup was originally planned for the 7th of November, but at the last moment some of the key conspirators lost their nerve. Napoleon gave them 24 hours to make a definite and final commitment, and postponed the attempt until Saturday the 9th of November, since he was superstitious about Fridays. On the 7th he lulled Jacobin suspicions by dining at Bernadotte's with the other Jacobin lions, Jourdan and Moreau, taking Talleyrand, Volney and Roederer as his entourage. By the evening of I-7 Brumaire all was finally ready. In return for forcing a change of constitution, Bonaparte had been promised by Sieyes that he would be provisional consul. He and Josephine dined early at the Ministry of Justice with Jean-Jacques Cambacérès, one of Sieyes's henchmen. Cambacérès was an eminent jurist, a Grand Master of the Freemasons and also the central figure in the Parisian gay network. Cambacérès expressed anxiety about Bernadotte, but Napoleon assured him he had found a way to marginalize him. Back at home Napoleon made careful preparations for next day. His aim was to force the directors to resign. The two chambers of the assembly would then have to decree a new constitution, and meanwhile all potential enemies had to be neutralized. But it is important to be clear that the objectives of Napoleon and Sieyes were already divergent. Sieyes envisaged an almost peaceful transfer of power backed by a show of force, but Napoleon had in mind a more significant role for the army. Busy with the meticulous planning for next day, Napoleon could not afford the time for the nightly meeting he had held with Barras for the previous week, partly to gull him, partly to convince Waivres that Barras was with them. At 8 p.m., he sent Bourrienne to inform Barras he would not be coming because of a headache. According to Bourrienne, this was the moment when the truth of what was afoot first hit Barras, and he allegedly replied, "I see that Bonaparte has tricked me. He will not come back. It is finished. And yet he owes me everything." Barras was at least more perceptive than Goyer, who suspected nothing until the very morning of I-8 Brumaire. So contemptuous were Napoleon and Fouch of him that they played an elaborate charade. Fouch one afternoon arrived while the Bonapartes and Goyer were taking tea. Fouch, who had come straight from a meeting of the conspirators, launched into a tirade to the effect that he was tired of hearing rumors of a conspiracy. Goyer reassured Josephine that there could not be any truth in the rumors, for otherwise the Minister of Police would not have repeated such frightening intelligence in the presence of a lady. On the 9th of November Napoleon rose at 5 a.m. and began to implement the coup proper. It was still dark, so first, ever superstitious, he located his lucky star in the sky. Reassured, he dressed hurriedly while whistling a popular ditty of the time, Vous avez gide un regard, Marinette. Then he sent round letters to all members of the Ancients, summoning them to an urgent meeting at the Tuileries at 7 a.m. on a matter of national emergency. At 6 a.m., as planned, 400 dragoons under Colonel Sebastiani received their final orders, and began making their way to the Tuileries. The clattering of the horses' hooves brought bleary-eyed citizens in nightgowns and cotton nightcaps to their windows, and shutters were flung open. One of Fouch's spies claims to have jotted down a verbatim exchange at the time. "So today's the day for clearing out the rubbish dump. It could be. Perhaps we'll have a king tonight. For God's sake shut up. I'm only repeating what I've been told. It's said that Barras invited the Comte de Provence to ascend the throne." Shut up. We haven't had a revolution merely to see the king back. What we need is a good Republican, someone really decent and with clean hands. I hope General Bonaparte has made up his mind to clear the 5 swine out. By 6:30 p.m. a stream of generals had begun arriving at Napoleon's door in answer to urgent summonses: Murat, Lannes, Berthier, Moreau, Macdonald. A little later Joseph arrived in company with Bernadotte who, alone of the generals, was not wearing uniform. When Napoleon coldly asked Bernadotte why he was wearing mufti, the Gascon replied that that was how he always dressed when off duty. "You'll be on duty soon," said Napoleon. But Bernadotte swore up and down that he would do nothing to harm the Republic and could not be swayed. The most Napoleon could get from him was a promise to remain neutral during the day's proceedings. To Joseph was allotted the task of shadowing Bernadotte during the day to make sure he kept his word. Among those summoned to the Rue de la Victoire was the military governor of Paris, General François Lefebvre. Napoleon asked for his help in saving the Republic. Lefebvre simply asked whether Barras was with them and, on being told that he was, pledged his support. Napoleon's next ploy was to summon Goyer, and then detain him so that he could not interfere with the day's events. He had Josephine send round one of her would-be billets doux, inviting Goyer for breakfast at 8 a.m. since all previous breakfast invitations at the Bonapartes had been for Rho a.m. Even the obtuse Goyer smelt a rat, and sent his wife instead. When she arrived, Napoleon angrily demanded her husband's presence, so Madame Goyer, doubly alerted, scribbled her husband a note warning him on no account to accept the invitation. Meanwhile, the Council of Elders had been meeting since 7 a.m. at the Tuileries. Sieyes used his majority to panic the elders into voting a decree to move their session to the Palace of St. Cloud outside Paris to avoid becoming victims of a Jacobin plot. Constitutionally, it was the elders who decided where the two-chamber legislative body should sit. A 4-article decree transferred the legislative body to St. Cloud, and the session was prorogued until noon on I-9 Brumaire. All continuation of the two councils' functions was forbidden until that place and time. In the final 2 articles, General Bonaparte was charged with the application of the decree and was formally summoned before the ancients to swear an oath of loyalty. At 8:30 Napoleon mounted his horse and, accompanied by a retinue of all the military talents, rode to the Tuileries. He strode into the Council of Ancients and solemnly swore to uphold the republic he was even then in the process of subverting. The chorus of echoing cries of "We swear it" from Berthier, Marmont, Lefebvre and the others introduced an ominous military dimension that did not go unnoticed by some deputies. Having received the decree making him commander-in-chief of all troops in the Paris area, Napoleon straightway altered it so as to include the bodyguard of the Directory. Next he addressed his troops, whipping up their indignation over the real and alleged way the Directory had betrayed the heroism of the army. Already Napoleon was thinking in terms of a genuinely military coup, and anticipating the time he would have to deal with Sieyes. By 8 a.m., the news of the Ancients' decree reached the Council of the 500. There were some protests but no real resistance to the idea of removal to St. Cloud. Meanwhile, Goyer and Jean Moulin, learning that Sieyes and Roger Ducos were no longer in the Luxembourg, made their way to the Tuileries. Napoleon informed them that Sieyes and Ducos had resigned as directors, as had Barras, and therefore the Directory no longer existed. But when he asked for their resignations, they refused. Goyer, moreover, questioned the legality of the elders' decree giving Napoleon command of all armed forces in Paris. Since the 2 directors were still a potential rallying point for his enemies, Napoleon had them escorted back to the Luxembourg and placed under house arrest. General Moreau posted sentries with orders to let no one in or out, and the surveillance was so effective that Goyer claimed he could not even sleep with his wife that night. Talleyrand meanwhile had dealt with Barras. Talleyrand and Admiral Bruix arrived at Barras's house shortly after 11 o'clock and informed Barras that the other 4 directors had resigned. It was surely understood that Bonaparte had appeared on horseback only because the Republic was in supreme danger, and in the circumstances Barras would surely not demur at offering his resignation. Barras signed without comment and appended a note saying that it was with joy that he rejoined the ranks of the ordinary citizens. Barras then set out for his country seat at Grosbois. The morning's events were a spectacular triumph for the venal Talleyrand. Napoleon had given him 2 million francs to bribe Barras if necessary. When Barras caved in without a struggle, a delighted Talleyrand pocketed the funds. Barras's inertia is surprising, and there may be merit in the idea that he was temporarily dissociated, semi-catatonic with shock at the treachery of Bonaparte and Josephine. All this time the usually volatile Parisian population had not stirred a muscle. Night fell on a scene of apparently total triumph for the conspirators. Bonaparte's military stranglehold on the city was complete. Yet neither he nor Sieyes were confident that they had won the struggle yet, and indeed it was an egregious error on their part to plan a coup extending over 2 days, allowing their opponents time to recover their nerve and regroup. Napoleon told Bourrienne, "Today has not been too bad. Tomorrow we shall see." All the same he placed 2 loaded pistols under his pillow. Bourrienne himself next morning drove past the Place d'Ire Revolution where the guillotine had stood and told a friend, "Tomorrow we will either sleep at the Luxembourg or we will end here." Sieyes, too, was concerned that the events of tomorrow would be no walkover. There were 3 principal dangers. First, Goyer and Moulin might escape or contrive to get word out that they had not resigned. Secondly, the ultra-republican army might not react favorably to the coup. Thirdly, and most importantly, none of the conspirators had thought through exactly how the legislature could be persuaded to endorse a legal transfer of power. The drama of 19 Brumaire quickly unfolded at the Chateau of St. Cloud. Napoleon surrounded the palace with 6,000 men under General Murat, and stiffened the military presence with Sebastiani's dragoons. In part the show of force was meant to overawe the guardsmen in the inner chateau, whose job it was to protect the assemblymen. The legislators arrived early for the scheduled noon meeting and found a scene of confusion, as contractors and workmen tried to get the palace, uninhabited since 1790 when Louis XVI and his family had spent their last carefree days there, into shape for the bicameral session. The arrangement was that the elders were to sit in the Gallery of Apollo, a vast hall with a ceiling painted for Louis XIV by Mignard, while the 500 occupied the orangery. But because of the delay, members of the elders and the 500 freely hobnobbed together, the exact situation CIs had hoped to avoid by keeping them in separate quarters between which communication was difficult, as feelings ran high among the angry councillors, now skeptical that there was any compelling danger to the Republic. It was counterpointed by an equal and opposite anger among the 6,000 men under Murat who surrounded the shadow. Clearly visible to the councillors, the soldiers kept up an angry bray of grievances which they imputed to the lawyers and speechifiers of the council. The meeting of the ancients began an hour late. At 1 p.m. immediately there was an altercation between CI's creatures and those members who had purposefully not been summoned the day before. Napoleon waited anxiously in another room while points of order and acrimonious debate protracted proceedings interminably. When it was proposed as a reaction to the resignation of the Directory that a new one be appointed, Napoleon could stand it no longer. He burst into the chamber, interrupting the debate, in itself an illegal action, and began haranguing the red-coated senators. The elders yelled at him to name the conspirators. Names, names. The cry went up. Others yelled out, Caesar, Cromwell, tyrant. Napoleon became confused and blustered about his military prowess, adding that his soldiers would obey him, not the ancients. Remember that I walk accompanied by the god of war and the god of luck, was one of his effusions. As the unimpressed Burian reported, he repeated several times, that is all I have to say to you, and he was saying nothing. I noticed the bad effect this gabbling was having on the assembly, and Bonaparte's increasing dismay. I pulled at his coat-tails and said to him in a low voice, leave the room, General, you no longer know what you are saying. Napoleon emerged from the gallery to find further bad news. From Paris, Talleyrand and Fouche warned him that the two councils' hostile reaction to him was already generally known in Paris, that the Jacobin generals Jourdan and Augereau were outside the shadow, urging Murat's men to have nothing to do with the coup. Napoleon had been bruised by the encounter with the ancients and it was ill-advised to meddle further, but it seemed to him he had no choice. He strode determinedly towards the orangery. It was now 4 p.m. Flanked by 2 giant grenadiers, Napoleon entered the chamber where the 500 were engaged in impassioned debate. The conspirators were in a clear minority here, and awkward questions had already been asked about the legality of Barras's resignation. Napoleon's appearance created a sensation. Once again he was present illegally, in full uniform, and troops could be seen through the open door. A red mist of rage seemed to descend on the deputies. They began climbing over benches, overturning chairs, desperate to lay hands on the trio. The immediate cries of "Get out! Kill! Kill!" were finally replaced by the ominous call for Bonaparte's outlawry. Horzaya, oil deputies laid hands on the grenadiers and began beating them up. Napoleon himself was seized and shaken like a rat. Murat and Lefebvre and a body of troops rushed into the rescue. Walking backwards, with great difficulty they extricated a dazed and bleeding General Bonaparte from the chamber. The cry continued, Horzaya, oil! There is controversy about the blood on Napoleon's face. Some say he was wont to scratch at facial pimples when under stress, and it was this that had drawn blood. Whatever the case, when he dazedly joined CIs and the ringleaders, he made the most of it and claimed he had narrowly escaped assassination. CIs, who knew the deputies were unarmed, was skeptical. Matters had now reached a crisis. There was no longer any possibility of a purely parliamentary coup. Force was required, and the question was whether the guardsmen, who guarded the shadow and officially owed their loyalty to the assembly, would heed the calls for outlawry. It was Lucien Bonaparte who cut the Gordian knot. Laying down his seals of office as president of the 500, he rushed outside, jumped onto a horse and exhorted the guard to do its duty. Inside the orangery were knifemen, assassins in the pay of England, who had just tried to assassinate General Bonaparte. He urged the guardsmen to go in and flush out the traitors. There was a moment of hesitation. Some deputies were still hanging out of the window and calling for Bonaparte's outlawry. Then the drum beat the advance. All afternoon the guardsmen had been considering their position. The deciding factor had been their conviction that if they did not obey Napoleon and his allies, he would unleash on them Murat's irate troopers slavering outside the shadow, and they would thus suffer the same fate as the unfortunate Swiss guardsmen in the Tuileries on Roe August 1, 792. The guard commander ordered the deputies out of the chamber on the double. When they refused, he told his men to clear them out, lock, stock and barrel. The guardsmen swarmed forward. Seeing that this was no drill, the panic-stricken deputies scrambled out of the windows into the orangery gardens. Next day hundreds of red togas were found caught up in the branches of trees or strewn on the ground. It was now s.o.o. p.m. Dusk was descending, and a thick bank of fog swirled around the palace. Demonstrating admirable presence of mind for the second time that day, Lucian had a quorum of stragglers from the 500 rounded up, some from local wine shops, others still cowering in the bushes. At 2 a.m. that morning 50 deputies from the lower chamber, together with the remaining elders, formally wound up the Directory and swore an oath of loyalty to a triumvirate of provisional consuls, Napoleon, CIs and ducos. The legislature was adjourned and 2 commissions were charged with drawing up a new constitution within 6 weeks. At IPM, Napoleon issued a proclamation putting his own slant on the events of the day and emphasizing the alleged assassination attempt by English agents. Why did Napoleon succeed in the coup of R8 Brumaire? In the first place, he was an immensely skillful politician, able to play off one rival against another, aware that the best way of telling a lie is to tell the truth but not the whole truth. He had learned from his bitter early experiences in Corsica that the way to emerge from the ruck was to appear to be above party considerations, to be beholden to no faction, to be au-dessus de I melee, and to appear to assume power reluctantly. He understood the importance of propaganda, image and myth-making in a way none of his rivals did. He had not won at Fleurus, Jacesburg or Zurich, and yet he was more popular than Jourdan, Hoche, Messina or Morau. This was because he had known how to convert the Italian campaign into the stuff of heroic, an epic legend, and to present the Egyptian adventure, actually a military failure, as a dazzling triumph. Most of all, he was lucky, disregarding the bad omen on the 30th of October, when he was thrown from his horse and concussed while out riding. He believed in his star and was confirmed in his belief. In the dangerous context of a coup, self-confidence is half the battle. Objectively, he appeared at just the right moment, when the French people had had enough of the revolution and wanted peace and retrenchment. The Jacobin experiment of decentralizing on a democratic basis seemed merely to have weakened France against the threat from abroad. All the other would-be putschists, Lafayette, Dumouriez, Pichegru, had appeared too soon and were too compromised by party political allegiances. Above all, Napoleon made his bid at the precise moment the all-important bourgeoisie was willing to contemplate one-man rule. He had shown himself willing to deal harshly with the urban proletariat, and with bred rioters, and this endeared him to the bourgeoisie, now the key class, given that the revolution had devoured its own communalist children. His mastery as politician was particularly evident in the analysis he made of the roots of power. He realized that the key to stability lay in entrenching the power of those who had benefited from the sale of national property, and he saw clearly the consequences of support for either of the 2 rival groups. To throw in his lot with the Jacobins entailed endless external war, while to endorse the Royalists meant sparking a bloody civil war. His reading of the popular mood was shrewd. The Paris crowd, that much feared behemoth of the revolution, did not stir a muscle, and though the Jacobins in the provinces tried to foment trouble, the people were too weary to face civil war. The coup of 18 Brumaire was really a dual affair. At one level it seemed simply the recognition of necessity, the confirmation in power of a wing of the Directory, a more sophisticated cabal of neo-Thermidorians representing the interests of the bourgeoisie and those who had benefited from the sale of national property. By excluding Jacobins and Royalists from national representation, Napoleon seemed merely to be consolidating the bourgeois revolution, and to represent continuity rather than change. Indeed, 18 Brumaire was the first coup since 1789 that unequivocally embraced the notion of private property as the supreme value. Thus far it can almost be bracketed under the rubric of historical inevitability. Yet at another level 18 Brumaire was the conduit that led Napoleon ultimately to imperial power. It is at this level that the coup seems a botched affair, a plot that succeeded only because of public apathy and the army's determination. The coup was twofold. There was CI's structural putsch and Napoleon's personal bid for power. This explains why what was planned initially as a transfer of parliamentary power by political legerdemain was finally attained only at the point of a bayonet. Consciously, Napoleon involved the army in a way that had never been agreed with CIs. Unconsciously, particularly on 19 Brumaire, Napoleon operated on the margin and took the risks he always liked to take, on the battlefield and elsewhere, so that a successful outcome multiplied his power and prestige. What seem on the surface blundering and inept interventions in the Ancients and the Council of 500 actually answered deep drives in Napoleon's psyche. There was unconscious method in his conscious madness. A few specific consequences of 18 Brumaire seem worth remarking. Bernadotte was a loser while Fouché, Talleyrand, Murat and Lucian were spectacular winners. Joseph had successfully marginalized Bernadotte on the 9th of November, taking him for lunch outside Paris while the Directory was being dissolved. Next day Bernadotte did manage to get some half-hearted messages through to the Jacobin Société du Mange, urging opposition to Bonaparte, but it was Jourdan and Augereau who did the spadework outside the shadow of St. Cloud. Later an apocryphal story was bruited about to the effect that Bernadotte panicked on the evening of 19 Brumaire, fled in disguise with Désirée, and hid for 3 days in the forest of Suart. Though blatantly false, the story did express symbolically the depth of Bernadotte's humiliation. According to Lucian's memoirs, Bernadotte later reproached himself bitterly for not having taken more vigorous action. He explained his ineptitude partly as weakness of will and partly because Désirée and Julie bound him ineluctably to the Bonapartes. Napoleon, as always, forgave him his disloyalty for Désirée's sake and because, through Joseph's marriage to Julie Clary, he was family. Early in 1800 Napoleon made him a member of the Council of State with lavish emoluments and gave him command of the Army of the West. As Bernadotte's fortunes dipped, those of his fellow Gascon Murat rose, to the point where he aspired to the hand of Napoleon's sister Caroline. Now 32, Murat cut a dashing figure, with thick, jet-black curls, dark blue eyes and good features marred only by a coarse, sensual mouth. Murat was the idol of the cavalry. He usually charged with his men in the front rank and was both adored and respected by them. A vulgar man with a Jacobin past and a strong Gascon accent, Murat was among the least intelligent of those in Napoleon's inner circle. Napoleon despised him for being an innkeeper's son and having been a draper's assistant, and strongly opposed his bid for Caroline's hand. But he allowed himself to be persuaded by Joseph, with the result that the marriage took place at the Luxembourg on the 18th of January 1800. All the Bonaparte clan was present except Louis, and Joseph gave Murat an appropriate wedding present by inducting him into the secrets of property speculation. Talleyrand, who would sacrifice any person and any principle for money, had pocketed 2 million francs from Brumaire. Some scholars have protested that Barrés's inactivity on the 19th of November is inexplicable, and that Talleyrand must have given him at least some of the bribe. A figure of 500,000 francs is sometimes mentioned, but the plain fact seems to be that Talleyrand got clean away with all the loot. Duplicity of a different kind was practiced by Joseph Fouché, who waited until dusk on 19 Brumaire to see how events would fall out. He closed the gates of Paris and kept them shut until he knew the certain victor, fully intending to arrest Napoleon and seize for treason if the coup miscarried. Napoleon Bonaparte, however, usually a thorn in his brother's side, acquitted himself splendidly on 19 Brumaire, assured the success of the plot, and wrapped a cloak of legality around a barefaced use of military power. Without question, if nonentities like Boulet de la Muette or Danton had been presiding over the 500 that day, Napoleon would have been outlawed. The financing of R8 Brumaire remains a murky issue. Prosperous tradespeople, alienated by draconian directory laws on tax returns, undoubtedly subsidized the operation, and it is known that the banker Collat advanced 0 francs. Some idea of who the other big contributors were can be gauged from the preferential contracts granted to certain individuals once Napoleon was first consul. But although bankers in general were sympathetic, they waited to see how events would turn out before committing themselves. In any case, the granting of large-scale loans required some convincing demonstration that the new regime was legitimate and enjoyed widespread support. Napoleon can be faulted for many things, but the idea that he destroyed liberty by his coup of R8 Brumaire is simply absurd. As the great French historian Vandal said, Bonaparte can be blamed for not having founded liberty. He cannot be accused of having overthrown it, for the excellent reason that he nowhere found it in being on his return to France. It is a supreme historical irony that the master of propaganda has been out-propagandized on R8 Brumaire by Madame de Staël, who claimed that Napoleon had a unique opportunity for introducing into France perfect freedom of the let 100 flowers bloom variety. Contemporary criticisms of Napoleon as undemocratic have to be treated with extreme caution. Madame de Staël and her circle did not want democracy as it is understood in the 20th century. Theirs was a demand for hegemony by an intellectual elite at best and by a cultivated section of the bourgeoisie at worst, and even the Jacobins wanted a democratic dictatorship. It is an unjustified slur on Madame de Staël to say that she bitterly criticized Napoleon just because he rejected her as a woman. But of her general criticism one can only say that Napoleon was excoriated for not granting a freedom Rousseau had not had under the ancient regime. After Brumaire, Napoleon resorted to scheming and broken promises to get rid of the limitations on his power which still remained. On 20 Brumaire he and Josephine left the house on the Rue de la Victoire forever. Henceforth Josephine was always to be found in her dream house at Malmaison. Napoleon spent most of his time in his office at the Luxembourg, maneuvering to get rid of Sieyes and Ducos, who had been named as provisional consuls alongside him. He was, however, happy to reward his friends, and the new appointments after Brumaire had a strong Napoleonist tinge. Fouché was confirmed as Minister of Police, Talleyrand was entrusted with foreign affairs, while Cambacérès received the justice portfolio. Berthier was made Minister of War, Lefebvre Lieutenant General, and Murat was given command of the consular guard. The army commands too were all Bonapartist appointments, Massena as commander of the Army of Italy, Morau as Supremo of the Army of the Rhine and MacDonald in charge of the Army of Reserve. For the next 5 weeks a constitutional commission met in the Luxembourg. Sieyes had the reputation of being the great expert on constitutions, but he believed in government by assemblies, which did not suit Bonaparte's purposes. At first Napoleon listened gloomily to the legalistic wranglings, cutting the arm of his chair to pieces with a penknife as he listened, in a characteristic gesture of stress. Tensions rose when Napoleon objected to Sieyes's proposed constitution. On December there was a particularly stormy meeting, in a private three-man session chaired by Talleyrand. Exasperatedly Sieyes said to Napoleon, "Do you want to be king, then?" Sieyes left the meeting in a black mood and Napoleon, equally irritated, told Roederer that he could get a new constitution ratified in a week if only Sieyes would retire to the country. Next day he got his wish. In the presence of Talleyrand, Roederer and Boulay there was a calm, polite discussion between Napoleon and Sieyes, which Roederer described as being like an academic symposium on political science. At the end of the meeting Sieyes tendered his resignation as provisional consul. Sieyes then tried to get Napoleon to show his hand by proposing that he be given the position of Grand Elector. Napoleon turned this down and made sure his propaganda machine got the people of Paris to know of his magnanimity. Confident that he had the people behind him, he commenced a war of attrition against Sieyes. In 11 successive evening meetings with the constitutional commissioners, at the Luxembourg Palace he wore down the opposition of Sieyes and his faction, prolonging meetings deep into the night and seeking to destroy his enemies through sheer physical exhaustion. In this contest the 30-year-old Napoleon held all the cards. He had physical magnetism and presence, he could concentrate on detail for hours on end without tiring, and he impressed everyone with his pithy common sense and exceptional intelligence. The internal coup which consolidated Napoleon's power came on 2 December. Working on his famous principle that constitutions should be short and obscure, Napoleon presented a constitutional document which was a masterpiece of ambiguity, ostensibly following Sieyes's principles, but really tailoring the draft to favor his own ambitions. Napoleon proposed that there should be a first consul with executive powers, flanked by 2 other consuls with advisory powers and checked by 4 assemblies, a council of state with 40 members, a tribunate with roux members, a 60-strong senate and a legislature of 300 souls. The object was to paralyze the legislative arm with a maze of checks and balances, leaving the first consul with virtually untrammeled power. Ministers were to be responsible to the consuls and theoretically powerful figures in their own right, but Napoleon had already calculated that he could divide and rule by, for example, countering the ambition of Talleyrand with that of Fouché, or setting Lucien as Minister of the Interior against Fouché as Minister of Police. A further weakening of ministers' powers came in the flanking proposal whereby 2 director generals drawn from the councils of state would shadow each minister. The entire constitution was to be ratified by plebiscite. On the 12th of December Napoleon brought his draft constitution into the legislative chamber, and got it adopted by 50 commissioners. The 3 consuls were supposed to be elected by secret ballot, but Napoleon, in a clever show of magnanimity, suggested that Sieyes should nominate them. He rubber-stamped Napoleon as first consul for 10 years and chose as his advisory second and third consuls Cambacérès and Charles Lebrun. This was supposed to be an act of balancing, with Cambacérès, a one-time member of the Committee of Public Safety, as a sop to the Jacobins, and Lebrun a concession to the monarchists. The vote in the chamber then took place by acclamation. There remained now only the hurdle of the plebiscite, which Napoleon insisted on turning into a personal vote of confidence for him. The referendum was an odd affair, where the only possible answer was yes or no to the proposed constitution. The ballot was not secret. The vote was given on property qualifications which favored those who were beneficiaries of Brumaire, and the scope for intimidation was immense, given that the vote did not take place simultaneously nationwide. The result seemed to be an overwhelming victory for Napoleon. 3 or 007 yes votes and only 562 noes. In Paris the figures were 12,440 yes and noes. Interestingly, there was a high no vote in Corsica. However, in an electorate of over 9 million, there was a huge abstention rate. Lucien at the Ministry of the Interior doctored the result by rounding up the individual figures for the departments, and then proceeded to add S0 notional votes from the army, which had not in fact been polled, on the ground that they must be in favor of Napoleon. In fact, only 1/6 of the electorate voted for the constitution. Napoleon now had dictatorial power in all but name. The people of France had agreed to one-man rule as they desperately wanted peace, stability, consolidation and an end to uncertainty. The royalist resistance, backed by the British, was degenerating into chronic banditry. The Catholic Church was in schism, with anti-revolutionary priests regarded as enemies of the people and pro-revolutionary clerics regarded as traitors by the faithful. The army was badly equipped even while shady military suppliers made fortunes. The Directory had scotched the snake of Jacobinism, but not killed it, and seemed violently opposed to liberty, equality and fraternity despite all the blood that had been spilled since 1789. General relief was palpable when a man on horseback appeared with clear-cut goals, a man wedded to authority, hierarchy and order, a realist and a reconciler. The people of France, or enough of them to make the difference, were impressed by Napoleon's sureness of touch and cared little if he flouted constitutional niceties. Historical necessity, it seemed, had produced Napoleon. No one yet realized that his genius was of the kind that needed constant warfare to fuel it and that all the hopes vested in him were illusory.